How is it that governments in Washington, bankers in London, and corporations in Tokyo all seem to end up promoting the same solutions to global problems? Is there some secret room where they all meet to coordinate a global conspiracy of elites pulling the strings behind the scenes? The truth is actually far more interesting and more complex. Because here's the thing, they don't need a secret meeting. They already share the same worldview. They went to the same elite universities. They read the same economic playbooks. They speak the same policy language. And as a result, they all tend to agree, often unconsciously, on what the right solutions are to global challenges. And that's what makes their power so effective. It doesn't rely on coercion. It isn't even always explicitly coordinated. Instead, it relies on consent and on the ability to define what's normal, what's necessary, and what's possible. In this video, we're going to explore Neo Gramscian theory, a critical approach to international relations that helps us understand how elites maintain global dominance, not through brute force or conspiracy, but by making their way of seeing the world feel like common sense to everyone else. This is about power, not just over resources or armies, but over ideas, institutions, and even our imagination of what the world can be. So let's pull back the curtain and take a closer look. To understand Neo-Gramscian theory, we have to start where it comes from, with Marxism. If you've already watched the Marxist IR video in this series, you'll remember that classical Marxism focuses on economic struggles, class conflict, and how the capitalist system shapes global relations. In traditional Marxist thought, power is rooted in material conditions: who controls production, who gets exploited, and how capitalism spreads. But Marxism doesn't always explain how consent is manufactured. Why don't the exploited always resist? Why does the system often reproduce itself, even without reliance on force? This is where Antonio Gramsci comes in. Antonio Gramsci was an Italian communist thinker and organizer writing during the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini in Italy in the 1920s. After Mussolini imposed his dictatorship over Italy in 1925, he sought to consolidate his power by arresting opposition leaders. Gramsci was among those arrested. While languishing in prison, Gramsci tried to make sense of worker support for far-right fascist leaders in Italy. From his perspective, it made little sense that workers would align themselves with the far right, with whom they had little in common. He believed that they should naturally be predisposed to support the communists and other progressive parties. But their support for the far-right fascists was unwavering. Why? More broadly, Gramsci wanted to figure out why the communist revolution had been so elusive in Italy and elsewhere in the West. To explain that, Gramsci developed several core concepts which have been widely adopted by IR scholars outside of Neo-Gramscian theory today. The first of those theories was Gramsci's notion of hegemony. Now, we've talked about hegemony before, drawing on realist perspectives that use it to describe a single dominant state, like the United States at the end of the Cold War. But unlike in realist theory, where hegemony means the dominance of one state over others, Gramsci's concept refers to the way the ruling ideas come to be accepted as common sense, even by those they disadvantage. He was interested not just in dominance, but in how dominance becomes accepted as legitimate and normal. To develop his conceptualization of hegemony, Gramsci engaged in an interesting thought experiment or dialogue with another Italian theorist, Niccolò Machiavelli. In The Prince, Machiavelli famously asks whether it's better for a prince to be feared or loved. And how does Machiavelli answer this question? Is it better to be feared or loved? He argues in chapter 17 that one should wish to be both, but because it's difficult to unite them in one person, it's much safer to be feared than loved. He continues, because this is to be asserted in general of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, covetous, and as long as you succeed, they are yours entirely. They will offer you their blood, property, life, and children, as is said above, when the need is far and distant. But when it approaches, they turn against you. And the prince who, relying entirely on their promises, has neglected other precautions, is ruined. Because friendships that are obtained by payments and not on the greatness or nobility of mind may indeed be earned, but they are not secured, and in time of need cannot be relied upon. Machiavelli thus concludes it's better for a prince to be feared because love is fickle and the masses can change their minds. But Gramsci argues that Machiavelli only told half the story. From Gramsci's perspective, relying on fear is a sign of a weak ruler, while the most powerful position is one where your ideas are taken for granted, as common sense and not subject to contestation in the first place. In contrast to Machiavelli, according to Gramsci, reliance on force represents the weakness, not the strength of the powerful. For Gramsci, hegemony represented the most powerful position for any class. Gramsci understood hegemony as intellectual and moral leadership, a situation in which the moral, political, and cultural values of the elite come to be accepted by society as a whole as common sense. This was the most powerful position a ruling group could occupy, far more powerful than simple reliance on force. For Gramsci, the ruling class doesn't just rule through domination, that is, through coercion via police, military, or other agents of force. It also achieves hegemony by leading through consent, by shaping what people believe is normal, natural, and necessary. Gramsci saw this kind of leadership as operating across two spheres, political society and civil society. Political society includes the state and its coercive apparatuses, things like laws, military, and the police. Civil society, on the other hand, includes institutions like schools, churches, the media, and voluntary organizations. While political society maintains order through force or coercion when necessary, civil society is where consent is cultivated. It's through civil society that ruling groups promote their values, norms, and ideologies, what Gramsci called their worldview, until they become accepted as common sense across society. Hegemony for Gramsci requires both spheres working in tandem, coercion when needed, consent wherever possible. This dual approach is what makes hegemonic power so stable and so difficult to change. In other words, for Gramsci, the key to power wasn't owning the factories, it was owning the narrative, controlling the ideas, the institutions, and the assumptions that shape how people understand the world. This is what makes his ideas so powerful and so relevant for global politics today. And while Gramsci developed these ideas to understand power and consent within the nation-state, Neo Gramscian scholars take those insights up to the global level, analyzing how elites build and maintain hegemony across the international system. Instead of just focusing on states or markets, Neo Gramscians ask, who defines the rules of the global system? Whose ideas become common sense? And, most importantly, how is global consent manufactured and maintained? In the early 1980s, Canadian scholar Robert Cox offered an insight. There's no such thing as neutral theory. All theory, he argued, serves a purpose. It reflects a particular perspective, usually the perspective of those in power. Or in his words, theory is always for someone and for some purpose. So instead of asking, is this theory true? Cox asks, who benefits if we believe this theory is true? That's a very Gramscian move, and it's the foundation of what we now call Neo-Gramscian international relations. Neo-Gramscianism shifts our focus away from states and diplomacy alone. It zooms out and looks at the global system, not just at how it operates, but how it's built, justified, and reproduced over time. To do this, the theory provides a powerful framework built on a few core ideas. The best way to understand them is as a logical story, starting with the ultimate goal. The goal is hegemony. As we've discussed, this isn't just about force. In Neo-Gramscian IR, hegemony is a global order where the interests of the powerful are accepted as the interests of everyone. It's leadership through consent, where a specific worldview, like neoliberalism, is framed as the only rational or modern choice, one that's presented as efficient, inevitable, and non-political. So if global hegemony is the goal, who is the main actors working to achieve it? Neo-Gramscians argue that this hegemony is constructed and maintained in what Robert Cox called a historic bloc, an alliance between material forces, institutions, and ideas that stabilizes this hegemonic order. It's not just governments, it includes corporations, central banks, universities, media, even NGOs. Together, they form a sort of self-reinforcing system that naturalizes a particular view of the world. It's like an ecosystem of actors who all benefit from the same rules and work, knowingly or not, to keep that system running. And importantly, these historic blocs are not limited to single countries. In today's globalized world, Neo Gramscian scholars argue that elites often operate through transnational alliances, connecting policymakers, multinational corporations, financial institutions, and intellectuals across borders. These transnational historic blocs help reproduce global hegemony by promoting shared values like market liberalism, investor rights, or technocratic governance, regardless of national context. This is how seemingly local decisions are often shaped by global norms. And when its hegemonic position is challenged by crises or social movements, the historic bloc deploys what Gramsci calls a passive revolution. This is a revolution from above, where movements that might challenge the system are co-opted. Reforms are offered, but only the kind that preserve the core system, not those that transform it. Think of structural adjustment in the 1980s or green capitalism today, market-based climate solutions that aim to address environmental challenges without disrupting the economic status quo. From a Gramscian perspective, green capitalism co-opts the language of a social movement, namely environmentalism, to reinforce the logic of the market, thereby diffusing the criticism and reinforcing the existing economic order. So how exactly does hegemony work at the global level? How do elites reproduce their dominance without needing tanks, coups, or secret meetings? Neo-Gramscian theorists argue that global capitalism itself functions as a hegemonic system, maintained not just through military alliances or formal treaties, but through a dense web of institutions, practices, and beliefs that make the system seem normal, inevitable, or even desirable. And within that system, institutions like the International Monetary Fund help maintain that order. When the countries of the Global South face economic crises, the IMF steps in with loans, but those loans come with strings attached called conditionalities. These often involve cutting public spending, opening markets to foreign investors, or privatizing state-owned industries. Now, on the surface, these conditionalities may seem like technical fixes, neutral policy prescriptions designed by economists to stabilize economies. But Neo-Gramscian scholars argue that these aren't just financial tools, they're ideological instruments. They exemplify what Gramsci calls a passive revolution. They reflect a very specific view of how economies should work, that markets should be prioritized over public services, that privatization is more efficient than public ownership, and that integration into the global economy is always desirable. In short, these policies promote a neoliberal worldview, one that often serves the interests of transnational capital and the historic bloc that upholds it. In other words, the very actors who shaped the IMF's policy agenda in the first place. This is how historic blocs work. Institutions, economic interests, and dominant ideas working together to produce outcomes that benefit the powerful. Over time, these policies get sold as best practices. Free trade becomes a given. Structural adjustment becomes reform. Global inequality becomes a market challenge. And the system keeps running because people believe there is no alternative. Take Latin America in the 1980s and 90s. Crushed by debt, many governments turned to the IMF and World Bank for help. What they got in return were structural adjustment programs, slashing education and health budgets, laying off public workers, and selling national industries. This wasn't just an economic policy, it was an ideological transformation, a passive revolution in Gramscian terms, a top-down reform process that reshaped entire societies to fit the neoliberal norms without addressing the underlying root causes of inequality or underdevelopment. But a passive revolution doesn't just happen through economic policy, it also happens through law. To understand the mechanisms of this passive revolution, Stephen Gill gives us the concept of new constitutionalism. For Gill, new constitutionalism refers to the ways that global elites use legal and institutional mechanisms to lock in neoliberal policies, making them resistant to democratic challenge or reversal. It works by creating rules, often embedded in trade agreements, investor protections, or financial regulations, that prevent governments from reversing market reforms. Once countries commit to these rules, it becomes extremely difficult to pursue alternative economic paths, regardless of who wins elections. Think of provisions in free trade agreements that let corporations sue governments for passing laws that hurt their profits, or rules that make central banks independent of democratic control, prioritizing inflation over unemployment or social spending. For Gill, this is a form of disciplinary neoliberalism. It's not just about persuasion, it's equally about creating legal structures that depoliticize economic decision-making, removing key questions from public debate altogether. In short, it's hegemony made permanent through law. And if citizens did protest, they were told that these sacrifices were temporary, necessary, or even modernizing. Resistance was managed, co-opted, or reframed as irrational. That's hegemony in action, illustrating how hegemony operates not through force, but through framing. It isn't just about governments. Consent is also built in civil society, in schools, media, think tanks, even NGOs. Elites fund institutions that promote their worldview. Scholars write reports that justify their policies. Journalists repeat economic mantras like fiscal responsibility or global competitiveness. And before you know it, one version of the world becomes the only version of the world. As former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher put it, there is no alternative. That's what hegemony sounds like. Indeed, the phrase was frequently used as a slogan of neoliberal consensus, and Thatcher herself used it as a political slogan to shut down debate and insist that market-based solutions were not only preferable, but inevitable. Neo Gramscian theory thus frames global capitalism not just as an economic system, but as a hegemonic order. Institutions like the IMF, WTO, and even universities help reproduce this order not just through rules, but by shaping beliefs. And when the system faces challenges, it adapts, offering a change that protects the core. That's a passive revolution. But even as Neo-Gramscian theory offers a powerful lens for understanding global politics, not just in terms of material power, but in terms of ideas, institutions, and consent, it's not without its limitations, and critics have raised some important questions. One common critique is that Neo-Gramscian theory can be overly structural, focusing on how elites reproduce hegemony and that it can downplay resistance, grassroots agency, or even unexpected change. If consent is everywhere, then how do movements like Occupy, the Zapatistas, or the Me Too movement emerge? But Neo-Gramscian theorists would push back on this critique. They argue that hegemony is never complete, never total. It must constantly be reproduced, reinforced, and defended because it's always being challenged. Gramsci himself described the relationship between dominant and subordinate groups as a war of position, fought not on battlefields but in schools, newspapers, think tanks, and in social movements. From this perspective, counter-hegemonic forces, movements that challenge dominant norms and structures and seek to build an alternative historic bloc with its own intellectuals, institutions, and its own common sense, are ever present. They may be marginalized or co-opted, but they never fully disappear. In fact, the very need for passive revolution and legal entrenchment, as Stephen Gill describes it, is evidence of the ruling bloc's recognition that its own position is vulnerable. Hegemony, then, is best understood not as a static structure, but as a dynamic and contested process, and movements like the World Social Forum and indigenous-led protests against extractivism in Latin America represent attempts to challenge dominant neoliberal logics and build alternative visions of global order. Another critique is that it can be theoretically rich but empirically thin. Terms like historic bloc or passive revolution may be conceptually deep, but they can be hard to measure, test, or apply in a concrete way. For students and researchers trying to use the theory to study a specific country or policy, it can sometimes feel methodologically diffuse. That said, Neo-Gramscian IR has made major contributions to the field and to our understanding of global politics. It shows that IR theory is political. Indeed, as Cox's famous line reminds us, theories aren't neutral. They reflect interests, assumptions, and ideologies. By interrogating mainstream IR theory itself, Neo-Gramscianism turns the discipline into an object of critique. Unlike realism or traditional Marxism, Neo-Gramscianism doesn't separate economics, politics, and culture. It shows us how ideas reinforce institutions, which reinforce economic hierarchies, and how all of these coalesce into hegemony. Neo-Gramscian theory also laid the framework for other critical approaches like postcolonialism and feminist IR and even green theory. By broadening the conversation beyond the state, it challenged who gets to produce knowledge in the first place. And by showing how power operates through ideas and social structures, Neo-Gramscianism created a foundation that feminist scholars would later use in analyzing patriarchy as hegemonic systems, and that post-colonial scholars could use to examine the lingering ideological power of colonialism. Whether or not you agree with its conclusions, Neo-Gramscian IR forces us to ask deeper questions. Who defines truth in global politics? How are global norms constructed, and by whom? What ideas have we accepted as common sense without ever even realizing it? And most importantly, what would it take to build a different kind of world order?